Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
There is a long-known and generally accepted Scotch-Irish influence in the Carolinas that is certainly apparent in family names and lineages. It is celebrated in music and art, deep within the culture of the Carolinas. Even a subtle, persistent influence of Celtic and Gaelic ethics in business and relationships. Welcome to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time, Ireland has been a study in change for sure, no doubt, over the last decade, economically, but certainly culturally and politically as well. While roughly the size of North Carolina in population, the Emerald Isles' rising influence in global and European trade, as well as investment, is becoming more overt and more important. On this executive profile, joining us is Ireland's ambassador to the United States, Her Excellency Ann Anderson.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded April 23, 2015. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring Ann Anderson, Ambassador of Ireland to the United States. And now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. Excellency, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very happy to be here.
Gosh, I almost don't know where to start, madam. You know, Ireland has been, certainly I would say, I don't think it's a stretch to say, a beloved country in the United States. It is, but Madam Ambassador, give us a sense of how does Ireland fit in? There's Northern Ireland, there's the United Kingdom, there's the EU, and then, of course, there's this relationship with the United States. So I know this is a very broad question, but how does Ireland fit in culturally, politically, and economically?
Well, we're a small island, a 32-county island, 6 counties Northern Ireland, 26 counties the Republic of Ireland, an entirely separate sovereign republic. We're obviously geographically just on the west of Europe, but we are an interesting case study of a country that faces both ways, really. We are a very committed member of the European Union. We have been for over 40 years a member of the European Union. We feel very strongly that imprint, being part of the European family. But of course, we faced west also to the United States. We have 35 million people here of Irish ancestry. The United States has been a great source of refuge and friendship for Ireland right throughout centuries, really. We had a huge migration here in the mid-1800s. We've had immigration for many decades subsequently. So we often have the question in Ireland, it used to be asked, Boston or Berlin? Which is our orientation? Of course, it's both. and also south of Boston. But that was a shorthand. Is it the United States or is it Europe? And it's really both.
Well, and that's interesting, ma'am, because you yourself bring to this post, I mean, certainly a career diplomat, but you bring to this post a very interesting point of view. You've been not just ambassador now to the United States, and I might say the first female ambassador. Congratulations on that, I think. You might have different choice later.
No, I feel good about it.
But you were Irish ambassador to the United Nations, to the European Union, to France, to Monaco. That seems fairly global in reach. How do you bring to bear some of this experience in your relationship with the United States?
Oh, I think it all fits together very well. Certainly the whole background in the European Union is very important, because a lot of my time is spent, of course, promoting Irish interests, concerns, values, the transatlantic connection, but I'm also very engaged in discussions about the transatlantic partnership. And indeed, when I speak and travel around the country, a lot of what I talk about is the relationship between the EU and the United States. Also, the background at the United Nations, the kind of issues that I followed very closely there, human rights issues, global issues, the perspective from Washington on so many of those issues is very important to us. Often it's a defining perspective. So I would certainly say that my background in the EU and the UN helps me to do the job in a fuller, deeper way. And it probably, I hope, makes me a more interesting interlocutor for some of my contacts in DC. Of course, we talk about the bilateral Irish-US relationship, but generally, if you're talking and engaging with senior political people, they're interested in ranging more broadly also.
I would like to talk to you a bit about TTIP, or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that is currently being debated, and hopefully with a good outcome for everyone. But I don't want to say chase it down a rabbit hole, but one of the important elements of TTIP is immigration. So often immigration in the United States gets couched in the idea that it's about Latin America immigration. Immigration does affect Ireland. And I want to read a quote, because you said it's difficult to reconcile that with extremely limited access that we have, meaning, I'm assuming to mean, and I'm asking you this, Madam Ambassador, does that mean that Ireland doesn't get their day in court, so to speak, when it comes to immigration?
I think that's a fair summation of it. When you look at the historical and the contemporary ties between our two countries, it's kind of startling and certainly sobering to reflect that less than 1/5% of green cards that are issued annually in the United States would go to Irish people. It's extremely difficult. It's not impossible. I mean, there are certain avenues of legal access to the United States, but very, very tough to get a working, living visa here for Irish people. And for example, during we've come through out of it now, but we've come through some tough years economically in Ireland since 2008. And there was a big surge in emigration, as you find when a country is going through a tough time. And the people went to Australia and they went to Canada, but came to the United States in very limited numbers, simply because there wasn't access. Now, the other side of that coin is, if you don't have legal access, you do tend to have a problem with undocumented people coming. And it has been important, I think, for us to put an Irish face on this whole discussion about immigration, because it's very much seen, of course, because of the numbers, as an issue about the Hispanic population and others. Now, the numbers of Irish undocumented, by definition, it's an inexact science. How are you going to count all your undocumented? They tend to be under the radar. But we reckon there are probably about 50,000, which in terms of the overall numbers here is obviously modest. But if you think of a country of our size, 4.6 million population, we're a very close-knit country, 50,000 people has a lot of ramifications in their families and friends in Ireland. So very many of those people, quite a high percentage, they're settled here, they're even working. And the biggest issue for them, of course, is they can't travel back home. Some of them have been many years here, and they're coming to an age where their parents are very ill or terminally ill, dying even. Questions: will you go back? Can you go to the funeral? Can you be there at the bedside of a dying parent? So it's a very human issue, as I have encountered it here.
So what, staying on this, ma'am, what do you think the United States, and I know it's going to be hard to separate it out from the Irish point of view, but how should the United States approach immigration reform? What would be fair, not just for Ireland, but what would be fair for the people in the United States as well as those who want to emigrate to the United States?
Well, it's obviously a huge question. I think there's a general recognition that something has to be done about the undocumented here. Yes, I mean, everybody recognises, and let me re-emphasise that, of course, we as government representatives, we would never advise or recommend anyone to come into the country in undocumented status. But it's a legacy issue that has to be addressed here in some way in the United States, because I think everybody right across the political spectrum recognises that all these people who are here illegally particularly in undocumented status, that they're not going to go home, or at least the vast majority of them aren't going to go home, and that therefore something has to be done to address that issue. And there are lots of proposals out there about making sure that people have paid their taxes, that they've no criminal record, and so on. So obviously a way to address that. And then looking in an open way at what kind of immigration policies are going to benefit the United States and are going to be seen to be, it's a very loaded word, fair, because it's a very subjective word, obviously. But I think, and what happened was back in the mid-60s, there was a reform in the whole immigration entry system, because people at the time felt that it was too much loaded in favour of Europeans and the developed world.
And this is the policy in the United States back in the 60s?
Yes, policy in the mid-60s. So there was a major reform. And I think everybody would have applauded it at the time, or most people would have said this is more fair to open it globally to immigration from the United States. But I think one of the unforeseen consequences about the way the rules were rewritten and in terms of just the detail of how they applied was that it made it much more difficult for European people to come to the United States. And Ireland suffered as part of that. And Ireland suffered probably more than any other European country because we had such a strong tradition of immigration here and so many ties to the United States. So I think fair would mean looking at national interests here, business, who's going to contribute, as well as fair in the sense of, well, every country looks at, you always have provision for some of the neediest around the world, but that tends to come more through asylum than through normal immigration provisions. So it's a huge question, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think most people, while they mightn't have the perfect answer, they know that the current system, both in terms of what to do about the undocumented and the kind of pattern of migration that you have, of legal migration into the States, that there's something out of kilter about that.
Would you expect, first question, ma'am, is that a number one concern for Ireland, is immigration reform with the United States? And number two, would you expect it to have sooner rather than later?
Well, it's certainly one of our top issues. I wouldn't put it perhaps as number one in that sense. We have we're very concerned about economic ties and so on. So it's a big issue for us, and it's certainly one of the top 3 or 4 priority issues for me. Do I expect it to come anytime soon? I don't know. I'm a bit disappointed, I have to say, in terms of the experience of my 18 months or so as ambassador. When I came to Washington, a bill for immigration reform had gone through the Senate. The general expectation was that with some adjustment, that a bill would go through the House, and then you would have a House-Senate reconciliation, and we would by now have had comprehensive immigration reform. So we did a lot of lobbying, a lot of talking to people. It looked like last summer that perhaps something was imminent, and then that effort collapsed. We're now, of course, the shadow of the next presidential election is already long. It gets cast very well in advance. Politics in Washington have become even more complicated than usual. There are some optimists still out there saying, look, as people both parties face into the election, they know that they need to address this issue, even in self-interest terms, let alone in broader terms. But I would say there are very many voices out there saying, look, the whole situation is so complex, so difficult on the Hill, that they would be betting against immigration reform before the presidential election. So we'll continue to lobby and to do everything we can to promote the prospects of immigration reform, and as I say, to explain where we're coming from.
Immigration reform is closely tied, closely related to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP for short. When would you expect some agreement, some solid agreement, TTIP, to be signed, sealed, and delivered?
Well, what people are hoping for and working towards is that there would be what you would describe as political agreement, certainly before the end of the Obama administration. Now, there may be loose ends to be tidied up and so on, because it's an enormously complex agreement. And to give you some idea of the complexity, we're in the 9th negotiating round at the moment, and they alternate between Europe and the United States. There are normally about 100 people on the negotiating team that comes over from Brussels for a round of negotiation. So by definition, if you're going to have a very ambitious agreement, which is what we hope for, it's going to be complex. So, but there are all of that series of issues to be addressed. But the hope is, and the push is, that by the end of the Obama administration, that all of the main pieces of the puzzle would be in place.
Talk a little bit about that in relation to been talk that the United Kingdom could very well not be part of the EU going forward. So let me ask you these two questions, ma'am. So goes the UK as goes Ireland? In other words, what would be the impact in Ireland if the United Kingdom did pull out of the European Union? And how does that affect negotiations in TTIP?
Well, we certainly don't want, and we're very clear about saying this, it's of course a decision for the United Kingdom, and there have been promises of a referendum, but we haven't held back in expressing our view that we think it's certainly better for the United Kingdom and better for the EU if the UK stays in the United Kingdom. And we will continue to be clear about that. There would be obvious complications for us if ever our nearest neighbour were to leave the European Union. But it's not a question of so goes the UK, so goes Ireland. That is not the question. We are, as I said, absolutely sovereign, independent country. And for example, when we had some years ago the big decision about whether to join the European currency, the euro, Ireland said yes, the UK decided to stay out of it. It was complicated at the time, obviously. There were some people in Ireland who were a bit concerned that given the intertwining of the economies of the UK and Ireland, this would be very difficult for us to be in the euro, the common currency, and the UK to be out. It worked out very well. We are a totally committed member of the European Union. And there is absolutely no question, even if the UK, which we hope it won't, if it should ever decide to leave the European Union, we would just have to work through the consequences of that while remaining a member of the European Union. As regards how it factors into TTIP, I don't think anybody is really talking about the kind of a fallback or that kind of a scenario. All of the negotiation is going ahead on the basis that the UK will continue to be a member of the European Union. If that should ever evolve differently, well, then people would have to adapt to the consequences.
So interesting to see, to watch what happens on the Emerald Isle. You've got, of course, as I referenced before, you've got Ireland, which is the Republic of Ireland. You've got Northern Ireland. And then last fall, and I'm sure you watched with great interest, the referendum in Scotland about separation from UK, and the ultimate vote was no, and they are still part of the UK. So as you have known your country's history, and now as you watch Scotland, and most likely will approach that decision again, what goes through your mind when you watch what happens in Scotland? Do you think they will ultimately become separate from the UK?
Well, it's difficult to give, and I'm a diplomat, so I have to give diplomatic answers. I think we were absolutely neutral in Ireland. I mean, that was a decision for the Scottish people, so people didn't, there was no question of a government opinion one way or the other about it. I think that Irish people probably were a bit conflicted in their thinking about it. Scotland, of course, it's a Celtic part of the United Kingdom. It's very much part of the Celtic family. We have lots of get-togethers of the Celtic family. We are the only sovereign nation within the Celtic family. And I'm sure some Irish people thought it would be nice to welcome others into that club. On the other hand, there were some very compelling arguments made about Scotland and its future within the United Kingdom, its European future, the concerns people had that if Scotland became independent, would that lead to further fragmentation of the United Kingdom? There were issues around that. There were some lively discussion, obviously, in Northern Ireland. So we stood back watched it closely and with great interest, but stood back from that debate.
Yeah, okay. One big debate going on in the United States is not going to be lost on you, because roughly 10 years ago, Ireland went through the debate of nationalizing healthcare reform. In fact, did change healthcare. What lessons can be learned in the United States about healthcare reform for what bad and good, Madam Ambassador, that Ireland went through 10 years ago?
Well, I think any country should be modest about giving lessons to others, particularly in fraught areas like healthcare, because I don't for a moment suggest that we, or indeed any European country, has all the answers right on healthcare. Healthcare is almost by definition very, very challenging for any country. And we still have our own challenges, and we have waiting lists and so on.
Is it better though than it was?
It's getting better, I think, people. But again, if you were doing this interview back in Ireland, you would be able to find plenty of voices in the street who would want to stop you, Chris, to tell you all about the issues that they encounter. But the underlying direction, we think, is right, and we are doing some interesting, and we continue to try and innovate in terms of our public health care. I mean, the first thing to be said is that there is a view that there should be a safety net for everybody in the country, and that people often say, and if I have the imprint of my UN background, it would be to say that how you treat the most vulnerable people in your country is always a test of the kind of country you are, and I think we don't always get that right in Ireland or anywhere else, but we do try to adhere to that. So I think the things that we would feel good about are those basic kind of safety nets, and about a third of the population, for example, would have a medical card which would entitle you to essentially the full range of services, basic medical services, without paying anything for them. We're also doing, and I think this is some very interesting thinking in Ireland, we're introducing it just this year, the government announced it in the last couple of months, free primary health care for all children under 6 in the country. That is irrespective of income and so on. And again, that's the idea, children are among the most vulnerable, but it's also a great investment for a country to, it's the education and the health of the children that are going to define where your country is going to be.
So not to interrupt you, ma'am, but do you think the United States is going in the right direction with healthcare reform?
Well, we would certainly see a direction that offers, as the health reform here is designed to do, to create a situation where you don't have sectors of the population without access to the basic health care. That, in a general European view and an Irish view, would be the right direction to go. I mean, it's of course Obamacare and how it works and all of that is, again, it's immensely complicated. But it's our philosophy, certainly, that you for all sectors of the population, you have access to a basic level of health care. It's a form of a human right, if you like, an economic and social right, as opposed to a civil and political right. But so a system that's going in that direction would chime with our values and our approach.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk about the economy in Ireland. It seemed to have a head of steam and going in the right direction, and then 2008 hit. And did it do more damage in Ireland than other countries because of the fragile, and that's not a fair way to say it, Excellency, but because of the fragile nature of the recovery in Ireland, or what? I mean, was 08, 09 devastating for the economy?
It was very, very tough for our economy. I mean, you saw, and you still see, Spain and Italy, and of course the continuing problems in Greece, so we weren't unique in the European Union. But I think what happened in Ireland and why it was so grievous was our economy had been doing so well beforehand. They were what was called the Celtic Tiger years. And our problems really came from the property sector in Ireland. And of course the intertwined problems of a property bubble and the banks who had loaned to the property sector and were therefore very exposed. So because the previous period had been so good and we had such phenomenal growth, that led to a property bubble, and the banks were very exposed, and that led to basically the kind of crash that you saw after Lehman Brothers and so on. The outworkings of all of that hit us very, very badly. So we went through a very tough 5 years or so, there's no question, period of austerity and cutbacks and bailout. The good news is that we're out of that, we're out of the tunnel, and last year was a terrific year in the Irish economy. We had almost 5% growth, which was the highest growth rate in Europe. And we're on target probably this year, also 2015, to have the highest growth rate in Europe. So what you're seeing now is broad-based recovery across all the sectors. But there's no question it's been tough, and it's required very strict discipline on our public finances. It's required a lot of cutbacks. There's been a lot of pain and sacrifice to get us to this point. But people basically got down to it, and we're fairly resilient people. We've been used to adversity.
It seems that way.
So we came through. But we still have residual issues, of course. But basically, we're through the worst.
Well, Ambassador Anderson, thank you for your time here. I suspect that Ireland is very proud of one of their favorite daughters here, and you certainly look the part, but are very gracious. And thank you for being on our program.
It's been really a pleasure. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching our program. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health. Bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco. A global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.